good morning. This is our Pastor's Corner teaching series. And in this teaching series, we have been journeying through the books of the minor prophets. And today we land in the book of Habakkuk. Actually, I wanted to share with you, this is actually one of my favorite minor prophets to look at. But we'll go through it for a bit and we'll just see what we can grasp from this. So again, if you're watching, I'm going to invite you here at this point to pause the video here and read the book of Habakkuk. It's 3 chapters long and to get a grasp for what we're to be talking about. So the book of Habakkuk, let me just give you some backdrop information that can help us as we understand this book. At this point, Habakkuk is the one who is the prophet. He's speaking to about the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom has fallen to Assyria, and the rising world power now is Babylon. At the same time, too, it's the same. The prophet Zephaniah is prophesying as well. And we just were at Nahum last week. Nahum is prophesying at about the same time, but he's prophesying in judgment of the Assyrian Empire, especially the capital city, Nineveh. Habakkuk stands as a little bit different. One, his name means to embrace, and I think there's something illustrative about this idea because he's looking for how to embrace what God is doing, and at the same time looking for comfort from God also. What's different about Habakkuk is that he's not prophesying against Israel, against Judah at this time. What he's actually doing is that he's actually talking to God. He's actually asking God questions. Actually, he's complaining to God, and God is responding to him. And so we're going to see how this dialogue works out and plays out. This book is written at around 612 to 606 BC, in that range. And again, this is the time when Babylon is kind of moving its way towards Judah as the world power that will eventually, down the road, they will actually destroy the southern kingdom and take them all into exile. So I want to highlight to you some key things from this book. In chapter 1 and 2, we have this back and forth, this argument that Habakkuk is having with God. And so in chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, he has this complaint. It says this: "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed. Justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted." And so Habakkuk is launching a complaint to God. He's saying, your word, the law that you gave us, it's being neglected. There's violence and there's injustice and there's corruption in the leadership. And so he's complaining to God. And God responds in verses 5 through 11. And God's response is actually really challenging, because he's going to then, in verse 6 particularly, he says this: "I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who will sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own." And so what God is saying to Habakkuk is, I'm going to raise up the Babylonian Empire, and I'm going to deal with all the things that you're complaining about, and I'm going to use Babylon to do it. Can you hear that? I'm going to use Babylon to do it. And Habakkuk is just going to sit there and go, what? Are you kidding me? How is this going to work? God's saying, I will do something, and I'm going to use the Babylonians to do it. So Habakkuk replies to God in verse 12 onward. He's like, what? What do you mean? And he's going to point out to God, wait, Babylon? They're worse. They idolize the power that they have. They treat people like animals, and they destroy nations that they come to. So God, they're worse than what we're experiencing now. What Judah is doing, Babylon is worse. So how can a good and holy God use corrupt people as his instrument? And so Habakkuk is stuck trying to figure this out. And in chapter 2, verse 1, what we have here is Habakkuk saying, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." He's going to stand. I'll be the watchman. I'm going to stand there and I'm going to watch. God, I need to know, and I need an answer, but I'm going to watch what you're going to do. And so in chapter 2, verses 2 to 5, God replies back to Habakkuk. And his answer is that there will be this appointed time. There will come an appointed time where you will see that even the righteous will continue to live by faith, but God is going to bring down even the Babylonians. See, at the end of the day, the nations will rise and nations will fall. And even the Babylonian Empire, they will not last. And God is going to use even corrupt nations to carry out his purposes and plans. Here's the thing, though, a lot of times is that, and we struggle with this too, God will use evil, but he's not endorsing evil. God will use an evil nation to bring out judgment, but it doesn't mean he is endorsing them. Back in those days, that's how people thought. Well, if good things happen, that means God is on your side. If bad things happen, God is judging you. We also think that a lot today, where when good things happen to me, God mustn't like me, and when bad things are happening, I'm being punished by God. God is saying, no, I will still even use evil for good, but it doesn't mean I'm endorsing what that evil is. Because at the end of the day, all the nations are accountable to God. No one stands outside God's accountability. And so he answers Habakkuk like that. But he also answers Habakkuk with a couple things. And so these, in chapter 2, you have 5 woes that get listed out. 5 things that God is going to deal with. The first is this in verse 6. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. So there's this idea of coveting and stealing and the injustice. In verse 9, woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. So God is going to judge these unjust economic practices. In verse 12, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. God will deal with the ideas of slave labor and violence and how people will build themselves up by using others. And in verse 15, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it out from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. And in that one, God is going to actually deal with the irresponsible leaders of the time. And a lot of times the way they were irresponsible was they would get other people drunk to take advantage of them. They would get them so, like what we say, wasted, that they would be able to steal and take advantage of these others. And so he was criticizing the leaders of their booze and of their sex. And then in verse 19, woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to a lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? Is it covered with gold and silver? There is no breath in it. And at the end of it, the last woe is the condemnation of idolatry. And the condemnation of idolatry is the last one, simply because when you worship an idol, when you worship something outside of God, all of those other things that he was condemning, all the other things that he was criticizing, are at the root cause of it. Because when you have an understanding of who God is, you will treat your fellow human beings in the way God would treat them. But when you worship an idol, these created things, you will take advantage, you will steal, you will lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead and just put people down. And so God is idolatry is the kind of root of all this. It's the engine that drives all these other issues that he's condemning and criticizing. And here's the thing, is that none of these are unique to Babylon. None of them are unique to Babylon, and in fact, none of them are unique to one nation. It is the human condition. This is our human condition of sin. And God's answer to Habakkuk is, I will use Babylon to judge this human condition for now, but they too will be held to account. And this is a question for us to see in later generations. How are we dealing with even our own sin issues as it pertains to this? And so then Habakkuk responds to God in a prayer. He responds to God in a prayer. His first thing is in verse 2. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day, in our time. Make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk comes back to God and says, God, do something now. Do something now. Help us to see this now. Act now. And God then demonstrates, his prayer demonstrates his understanding of God in verses 3 to 7. And in this verses 3 to 7, you have this idea of what's called theophany language. And I just want to read that to you. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hands where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. But he marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress and the dwellings of Midian in anguish. What you have here is this description of when God shows up, it's awesome. and it's scary at the same time. It is amazing and it is scary at the same time. In verse 8 following, what we have is this description of God having this image of a future Exodus. And it portrays the same image that Israel experienced, that God delivered them in the Exodus from Egypt, which was evil, from the bondage of Egypt, which was the idea of sin and slavery. And God is going to continue to do that down the road with this narrative for us to see, is that God continues to do that in this Exodus journey for delivering us from the bonds of sin and slavery as well. And so God will continue to deal with all these issues of evil, and everyone who does evil, all the nations that do evil, will be held to account. And so eventually there will be justice for all. All the wrongs will be made right. And so here's how the ending comes for Habakkuk. It says this in verse 18, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." And so that's how it ends. And what it is that Habakkuk is going to choose joy. He's going to choose to trust that even though the world is falling apart, even though all these wrongs are going on, he's going to trust and choose to trust God and to follow God in joy. And so really, he's making a choice to have faith in God. And so that's the story of the book of Habakkuk, this minor prophet. And what I take from it is simple. There are a lot of things that are just wrong in our world today. And we can cry out to God and we just, where are you? Why is this happening? Why do bad things happen? And we cry out to God. And Habakkuk was doing that too. He was crying out to God. And in fact, sometimes we even see how people who are evil can thrive, and how this Babylonian Empire can be the one to be used by God. But don't forget that just because someone is thriving or something is thriving, it doesn't mean that God has endorsed them. But we are always going to be held accountable to evil, and God is going to make all these wrongs right. And so we have a choice to be like Habakkuk. We can choose at the end to choose joy and to choose faith in a God that makes wrongs right, in a God who is just and holy. And that's the story of the book of Habakkuk. So I hope that has been a challenge for us, something to encourage us as well. Until next time on our Pastor's Corner teaching series, love and peace as we continue to explore the minor prophets.